All right. Good evening. Welcome to Black History Month at the College of Staten Island. My name is Nora Santiago. I'm an urban policy analyst, GIS specialist here at CSI. It is my honor to be part of this year's celebration. The Office of Sustainable Community Planning hosted GIS Day last November, focusing on racial equity, social justice, and sustainability, and how GIS can be used to visualize the systemic racism that exists in our society today. We recognize the critical importance of continuing this important conversation and quickly connected with North Star, an organization that is deeply thinking about how GIS can help create more equitable and just environments. North Star is a community group working to increase representation, belonging, and inclusion of people of African descent in GIS. They are hosting a number of events this month. I encourage you to check it out. I would like to introduce our speakers tonight, Clinton Johnson and Reina Kana. Clinton is a solution architect on the global architecture team and the leader of the Esri Racial Equity team. Clinton helps organizations create geospatial strategies for equitable outcomes. He takes an empathic approach to technology that begins with understanding real world challenges faced by diverse communities and finding creative ways to implement practical solutions. Clinton leads Esri's racial equity team. He also founded and leads North Star. He is also an advocate for belonging and equity for people from underrepresented groups in the GIS and STEM more broadly. Our second speaker tonight is Reina Kamau. She's a Kenyan native who has been living in the US since 2013. She is co-founder of Black Girls Map and works as a strategic advisor for partners at Esri. Black Girls Map focuses on community mapping and evangelizing GIS in underserved and underrepresented communities. The group celebrates Black women in the field of GIS and uses maps and apps to visualize social justice issues using location intelligence and amplify the voices of marginalized and unheard communities. So as for today, the agenda will start with Clinton giving us a presentation and overview of how GIS applies to racial equity. Then Reina will deliver a demonstration of the tools in action. And then we're going to conclude with question and answers. What I would like to do is for you to please put your questions in the chat during the presentation. And when we are done, I will read out each questions and our presenters will answer them. So please welcome Clinton and Reina.
Thanks, Nora. I'm excited to be here and to meet you all virtually. As you heard, my name is Clinton Johnson and my pronouns are he, him, his. And before we get into the presentation, I just want to thank all of you for participating in our Black History Month series. We've put together a robust schedule of activities for the month, and we hope that the content that we share has a positive impact on you. This series was developed in collaboration with several organizations with the intent to grow community, share our individual and collective stories, and to showcase expertise of GIS professionals of African descent. Our organizations have come together under a set of interconnected purposes. Most of our organizations are focused on equity and belonging in GIS, like North Star, as you heard, a community organization founded and led with a focus on increasing representation, belonging, and inclusion of Black people in GIS, but also with a heavy focus on GIS for racial equity and social justice. And most of our organizations are also focused on social impact, like Black Girls Map, which celebrates and connects marginalized communities using GIS to navigate social issues and empower change. And we've all come together to focus our efforts in these areas on the Black family for Black History Month this year. This year, the theme for Black History Month, as set by the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, is the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity. We want to intersect We wanted to intersect the theme with GIS, and since GIS is a powerful tool for framing and answering questions, it seemed natural that we'd ask and attempt to answer one of these really important questions for our community. Who maps the Black family? And some of the key aspects of the theme, as set by the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, are that the Black family is a topic of study in many disciplines. The Black family is said to be the foundation of life and history of the African diaspora. It offers richly diverse tapestry for exploring our past and our present, and it's been reverenced, stereotyped, and probably equally vilified over the past 400 years. So, our call to action for all of you in attendance at our sessions is to consider how you can help us to create and hold seats for Black people at the tables where folks are addressing issues that impact our families disproportionately. Of course, the series throughout the series we intend to share, our interconnected heritage and the impact that the African diaspora has had on many other cultures in the world. We want to, share innovative uses of tech, and we want to explore opportunities in our individual and collective pursuits of progress for the Black family. As I said, we have a fairly robust schedule. Today, we're talking about racial equity for resilient and prosperous families. But be sure to check out all the other sessions throughout the rest of the month and from our Facebook site, which we should share a link to. You can even get an overview of the first event. So Black families all around the world are trying to live healthy and successful lives. They're trying to make the best of their community resources to provide strong foundations for prosperity and health for their children, and their kids are just trying to live and grow up. Yet far too many are struggling to persevere against a wide range of racial inequities across a broad spectrum of topics. Some communities are dealing with underfunded schools and over policing. Some families are dealing with intergenerational economic hardships and underemployment. And far too many children are growing up with limited access to tech, yet overexposure to toxins. And many individuals, communities, and organizations are working to understand and to unravel these injustices. Many cities, counties, and states have even declared racism as a public health crisis. These issues are complex. So I want to try to be clear about some of the key terms. Let's start with identity. Social identity relates to how people are identified in relation to others based upon multiple intersecting social characteristics. And by how people are identified, we mean both how people self-identify and the assumptions that people make about others' identities. We're going to focus on racial identities, meaning those social identities that relate to a racialized characteristic like race, but also ethnicity, religion, language, country of origin, and so many other factors. And location is an important social characteristic, meaning where people live, work, play, or grow up has an impact on how they perceive themselves and are perceived by others. So racial identities are fairly complex. You can think about identities like African American boys in low income communities in Philadelphia, Latinas in their 20s living in Texas, or white men in their early 30s living in Miami, Florida. We also want to talk about disparities. A disparity being a noticeable or unusually significant difference. And social disparities in the framework that we're going to show today are disparities in community conditions and outcomes between people of different social identities. And racial disparities are significant differences between people of different racial identities. Some examples include pay gaps, wealth gaps, disparities in educational outcomes, and disparities in exposures to toxins. And inequities are disparities that are the result of injustices. And disparities effectively place a higher burden on one group relative to another, like how disparities in COVID-19 health outcomes placed a higher burden on Black families than white families. So racial equity is really important. And there are generally three different ways that people answer the question, what is racial equity? Racial equity is a condition that is met when policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages no longer produce racial inequities. It's also a process. It's the actual work that's done to address racial inequities. Both the condition and the process require analysis, some assessment or root cause analysis of racial inequities. And ultimately, the goal is to achieve the condition by doing the process and validating and informing actions all along the way by doing the analysis. Overall, the goal is to achieve that condition such that people, regardless of their racial identity, can thrive. And generally, we refer to the analysis as applying a racial equity lens. To effectively assess issues, organizations are trying to apply a racial equity lens to examine and address disparities. Racial equity lenses include race, ethnicity, and caste, as well as religion, language, country of origin, nationality, and immigration status. Moreover, these factors intersect with other social characteristics, including gender, sexual orientation, age, and ability, and characteristics that communicate the concept of class, like income, home ownership, and more, all of which either impact or is impacted by where people live, work, play, or grow up. So equity work is rarely about race alone. Racialized identities can consist of all these factors and more. So an organization that's trying to identify, let's say, disparity rates in asthma, hospitalizations in one community or another might explore population groups like Black girls between 6 and 10 living in median income communities versus Latinas in their 20s living in high income communities versus white men in their early 30s living in low income communities, to determine whether or not there are disparities in how cases of asthma related hospitalizations compare with regard to the proportion of someone in the population. And GIS provides resources and guidance to help folks apply an intersectional racial equity lens to assess overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination like racism, sexism, tribalism, classism, xenophobia, homophobia, and so on. In fact, GIS offers a lot of spatial data to help organizations explore, understand, and confront issues like these. Like how the W.K. Kellogg Foundation used spatial data to assess healthcare access for Black women and their babies in New Orleans, and how Territorial Empathy in New York used maps, animation, and audio to show the impact of COVID-19 on communities over time, and highlighted the devastating disproportionate impacts of the disease on communities of color, with Black and Hispanic or Latinx communities and families most significantly impacted. We also realize that these inequities are intrinsically and structurally related and therefore create a wide range of experiences and outcomes for people across different communities. And very often we find ourselves focusing on outcomes when thinking of inequities, issues like disparities in whose families are facing more instances of chronic health conditions and experiencing higher infant mortality rates or lower successful birth outcomes. But racial equity best practices recognize that there's a relationship between those kinds of disparities and the disparities in community conditions that contribute to those outcomes. And root cause analysis best practices recognize that inequities and outcomes and community conditions all flow from decisions and practices further upstream. This is a model that's heavily influenced by the work of King County, Washington, and the organization known as Race Forward. And in this model, outcomes are the indicators of how people fare. That is to say, how individuals, families, and communities fare socially and economically. Outcomes include things like educational attainment and school attrition, prevalence and severity of chronic disease, and many other social and economic results. Community conditions are the circumstances surrounding individuals and families where they live, work, and play. And community conditions, include circumstances like access to quality healthcare, to education, to parks and recreation, housing and environmental conditions, and many other conditions across a wide range of concerns. And decisions and practices are the policies, programs, systems, and budget decisions that influence the circumstances surrounding individuals, families, and communities, impacting how they fare. And that includes historic and contemporary practices and decisions that have been made by governments, businesses, other organizations, and communities themselves. And decisions and practices may create or sustain things like structural racism or other forms of discrimination, bias against or for people based on their class, their gender, or so many other social groups, inequitable distributions of resources and power, or intergenerational inequities, meaning any combination of the above impacting multiple generations of families or communities over time. This model helps us to understand and address the root causes of racial injustice. For instance, let's take a look at this study in Charlotte, North Carolina, done by Clean Air Carolina. And this study highlights a priority area surrounding the center of Charlotte, where residents tend to have higher rates of negative health outcomes like chronic conditions like high blood pressure or diabetes, and behavioral health risks like smoking and obesity, and higher rates of death. There also appear to be disparities in several community conditions, including exposures to toxins. For instance, the historic West End, which is a predominantly Black community, has a disproportionately higher concentration of factories, truck stops, waste sites, and other large emitters of harmful air pollution. And when we look further upstream to decisions and practices, we find that in Charlotte, like in so many other cities, there's a history of segregation and a history of redlining. And people in the historic West End in particular live with a long-standing legacy of industrial zoning and highway construction, where time and time again, large sources of air pollution were cited in or near communities like the West End, where people had less access to wealth and less access to political power. And GIS provides a wide and growing array of techniques and tools to help organizations understand, unravel, and deal with these interrelated concerns, address barriers to equality, and design futures where all communities and all families are equitably served. And while we're living in this moment amid a global pandemic that's revealing a wide range of racial inequities, leading to a broad range of disparities in how COVID-19 is impacting Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian communities, including disproportionate health outcomes with Native Americans, Black people, and Latinx folks experiencing much higher rates of hospitalizations than others, challenges for children getting educated in online environments, which increase risk of poor educational outcomes for families that are already on the wrong side of the digital divide, which are disproportionately Black children. And racial inequities in wage loss and business outcomes, with the pandemic putting nearly half of Black small businesses at risk of being completely wiped out, putting Black workers at risk with compounding effects of upon pre-existing economic inequalities that they were dealing with before the pandemic. And the pandemic has proven to be nearly 3 times more deadly for Black and Latino communities, leaving the US Surgeon General and many others working to direct their communication outreach efforts to make sure that they are acknowledging the harms of the past, demonstrating a commitment to change, and ensuring that communities of color can make the best decisions they can about their health right now. And many organizations are stepping up to do their part, recognizing that racial injustice is everyone's problem to address. And Esri is standing by its commitment to work with all of you to leverage the power of geographic and holistic thinking to increase understanding, but not just create an understanding of where inequities exist, but to create solutions that will ultimately help to bring an end to those longstanding injustices. And towards that end, last summer, Esri began to provide guidance and resources to help all of you map and understand racial inequity, providing a racial equity hub that includes examples of how organizations are using GIS to advance racial equity, and curating and sharing relevant data to help you all visualize and analyze inequities in your jurisdictions. Over time, we've evolved this guidance to help organizations apply GIS as a framework for racial equity. And that begins with applying a racial equity lens. And as we all know, race and place matters. And as I said before, GIS provides data, tools, guidance, all to help you apply a racial equity lens to the community conditions and outcomes in your jurisdictions. You can also integrate GIS with best practice workflows for advancing racial equity and social justice. The racial equity workflow is a critical aspect of applying GIS as a framework for racial equity. This workflow was derived from emerging and best practices for advancing racial equity and social justice. And we just infused those standard methods with best practices for GIS and location intelligence. Organizations working towards racial equity need to inform, they need to be informed by, and they need to collaborate with stakeholders inside and outside of their organization. So engaged communities is at the core of this workflow to support everyone's efforts to increase awareness, understanding, and collaboration at every stage of the process. So we encourage people to deploy racial equity community outreach solutions to enable their organizations to engage stakeholders around focused initiatives and key metrics. Use surveys and crowdsource information so you can ground truth your understanding of needs, and tell stories integrated with maps to share a complete narrative, putting the issues and solutions in the proper context. Organizations working to advance racial equity are trying to proactively seek out racial inequities, to identify clear goals and objectives and measurable outcomes, all the while engaging communities in the process. So the first stage in the workflow is map and analyze inequities, meaning applying a racial equity lens to reveal and understand inequities, to locate populations of concern, and to identify barriers to equality. So at this stage, we encourage folks to tap into rich data sources to augment their own, to use tools that can give them an insight into what communities look like, and find training resources and take advantage of Esri's Racial Equity Hub to get an understanding of how to get started and to tackle some of the more challenging scenarios you may have to deal with. And with that understanding of where inequities are, organizations seek to infuse their efforts with their actual efforts to deliver services, to perform their business operations with racial equity and social justice best practices. That way they can ensure that their programs and services are distributed equitably, and make sure that they are delivering the right interventions and doing the policy work necessary to create real change. So operationalize best practices is the stage where folks will seek to design and plan more equitable allocations of resources so that they can reduce burdens on communities of color and create more benefits instead. So we encourage everyone to use ArcGIS and all of its flavors to identify more equitable resource allocations, to automate the work, including the work that's being done on the ground by teams that are driving change, um, and to inform decisions using the right configurations of products, data, and training and services. Finally, organizations need to ensure that their efforts to increase equity are having the impact they seek. So in the managed performance stage, organizations use decision-making tools in order to visualize racial inequities at a glance, to adapt strategies and operations dynamically. So use maps and dashboards to assess your impact and identify wherever there may be opportunities to increase equity. Compare your workforce, volunteers, compare the people consuming your services, whether they be customers or constituents, and look at how well they reflect the communities that you exist within. And go beyond simply looking at race or gender alone, and look at more nuanced population groups in a way that will more effectively enable you to assess and support the most vulnerable. Of course, organizations are going to find themselves in different stages along this journey. So some may be ready to operationalize their best practices. Many may be in the midst of managing performance and ensuring equitable impact. Undoubtedly, people will need to repeat this cycle anytime a major event happens or on some logical frequency. So just jump into the cycle wherever you are and just keep moving through the process, and you'll be sure to maximize your impact. And to support efforts to automate your practices, you can also leverage product and solution configuration guidance, recognizing that leaders all across the globe are challenged with addressing racial equity in the work that they're doing in their organizations. So they need tools and resources right at their fingertips, apps that'll help inform decisions and actions to ensure their work is creating benefits for marginalized communities and not burdens. So take advantage of solutions that align with your organization's workflows, as well as product configuration guidance to configure your own um, capabilities and find ways to help your GIS teams deliver the right maps and apps to the right leaders at the right time. Finally, there's an envisioning process that all should consider when they have enterprise-wide racial equity initiatives. So understanding that many leaders across all sectors today are making commitments towards racial justice and just doing racial justice and equity work as a part of the normal course of business. There's a growing list of racial equity leads who are working to organize and oversee racial equity initiatives and drive impact across their entire organizations. So take advantage of resources to facilitate your understanding of priorities, impact, and scope in a structured manner that allows you to create geospatial strategies that help your leaders orchestrate the delivery of geospatial capabilities to drive racial equity throughout your communities. So there are a wide array and a comprehensive set of GIS and location intelligence resources that can help you address a broad range of inequities. And I'm sure you're all tired of hearing me talk about it. So I'm going to let Raina Kamal show you GIS in action.
Thank you, Clinton. I may need to be enabled to share my screen here. So I'll try that one more time. And I think we're good to go. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Clinton. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. And, we all saw last year what happened, right? Last year is very impactful, especially when we talk about racial injustice and racial equity awareness. There was a conviction that swept across the whole country. And this awakening was also kind of shared by organizations and companies. So they oftentimes, or you oftentimes heard, we want to donate money, right? And although that's good, right, that's commendable, there was always that question that came in where or the community was asking, well, what are the companies doing internally? How are your diversity metrics within your company? And what you're seeing now is a product that we put together, or a dashboard that we put together to help organizations to understand the equity distribution within their own company. So this application or this solution will pretty much help answer the question, how are we doing in regards to diversity and inclusion in our workforce compared to the community? That's what you're seeing over here. And number two, where are the gaps in the stores that we can improve on our DNI index? So these elements, you have the legend over there, you have a comparison chart where you're able to understand the diversity index of the community against the diversity index of where that store is within that community. And in this same kind of view, you can switch to this equity score dashboard, or just the view, the equity score view. And equity score is not something that Esri calculated. We actually mocked up this calculation to prove the capabilities of the Esri software, but primarily these scores were created by calculating the ratio between certain outcomes for the least and the most advantaged racial ethnic groups. And so they're able to understand, right, in different facilities or in different stores or in different branches or offices, this is the equity score. We're doing good, which is indicated by green, or we're doing bad, indicated by red. So the last kind of widget that you see here is the community education attainment. And this is just to give the organization leaders an understanding of how the community is doing in regards to certificates, degrees attained, and they can also kind of have this metric of understanding the distribution of employed versus unemployed. Again, this can always be evolved into incorporating racial equity factors as well. So I'll give you a quick example, right? If I was to get in here and I wanted to find out, okay, I want to see which stores are not doing good, I'll come to this equity score view and click on the low. When I click on that low uh, category, I have a list of all these low stores that have measured low in regards to their equity score. And a good example is maybe, for instance, if we zoom into Memphis City, we see that we have one store that is not it's scored low, and we want to understand why is this happening in particular. So I'll zoom into that, but not only that, I can go back to the store and community index, and what I can take a look and see is that the community diversity index shows this might be, or this is, a predominantly black region or geographic area. But the store itself, it seems as though we have a higher percentage of white staff, right? So this is pretty much just some tools that we can use to be able to analyze equity. And if we zoom out even more, we're able to kind of have that understanding looking at this legend that the predominant category or the predominant race living within here is the black population or the black community. So as a store leader or as a company leader, this is one of the stores where we want our store to match our community diversity. One of the stores that we will have to kind of take a look at. And not only can you do that, right? You can take a look at these infographics where you can analyze or get some more in-depth information about the race and age comparison of that particular area. So you have this broken down in what we call the Esri infographics, which can be tailored to different geographic areas, and you're actually able to understand the distribution of the race, and not only population by race, but also race distribution by age here. So that's pretty much what I wanted to share for this particular demo here. Again, this can be evolved, because a few questions that we get a lot when we present this is, can this be evolved to incorporate role-based equity? Can we understand the distribution of our black employees in management as opposed to other races, or maybe other marginalized races? So this can be evolved, and this is one of the tools, like Clinton was saying. Location intelligence really plays a big part in that visualization process. So I'm going to go to the next application here. And just like we saw a lot of companies wanting to donate and wanting to make an impact with how their company was structured in regards to that diversity and inclusion, we put together this in line with the fact that there were organizations or companies that wanted to take that next step. They wanted to understand, how can we get into youth mentorship? How can we help with that pipeline of students coming into our organization? And so these organizations wanted to give back, especially in that academia route. And so we put this together because we thought it would be good, number one, to understand where these minority serving institutions, where as an organization or as a company we can make an impact. So what you're seeing here is a dashboard that has visualized three synced maps, and one of the maps has maybe sample branch locations. So this map would pretty much hold the locations of different offices, different stores, different branches, for instance. And then the second map is a map that has been populated with the HBCUs, the location, and it's actually been symbolized by the population for the graduates, or for the undergraduates that you can see here. And in that last map that you're seeing there is the all minority serving institutions. So if you want to take it a notch higher, right, you can take a look and understand which Hispanic serving institutions or tribal colleges or universities are we supporting. And with something like this, very very simple, right, you can be able to understand, okay, within this San Antonio, or is it St. Louis area, we're able to see which schools are within our neighborhood that we can contribute or we can provide support, be that through scholarships, be that through mentorships, that can all be tabulated or just all visualized using this dashboard. And so this was a very a quick dashboard that we put together just to kind of show and prove that you can use GIS and you can use Esri Tech especially to visualize most of these kind of topics and areas. And I'll go to my last application here, which is something that I actually I was proud to be a part of here. Black Girls Map, we came together and we kind of put this call to action where we last year we just wanted to make an impact, especially in these upcoming elections. And so this next application that I'll start to showcase here was actually put together by a group of volunteers by the name of People for the People, right? And this was a GIS community focused group, and we wanted to empower community members and engage community members to be or to have the resources about civic issues. So what the group did was we were pretty much creating geospatial solutions to recenter, political issues back on the people, your friends, your family, your neighbors. And we wanted to do that by elevating marginalized communities. And so leading up to the election last year, P4TP, which is People for the People, we used GIS to reimagine how we engage with these politicians and with politics as well. And one application that is something that we found pretty revolutionary was the sentiment app, the race relations sentiment application. And what this application does, it pretty much just you're able to map out sentiment. There is a survey embedded within this application where you can answer the question, how do you feel about race relations here in the United States, right? You just have to get into the app, you tap on a word. If I wanted to understand, okay, why do people feel tired, right? I'm able to see some of the responses that we see here. And not only that, but we have embedded kind of like this chart where you're able to understand the race distribution of that particular geographic area. Now, the tech used behind this, number one, is Survey 123. For those who haven't, who don't know about Survey 123, it's pretty much like it says, a tool that you can use to collect data and to collect information. And so the questions that went into this application was, number one, in one word, how does the recent handling of race relations in the US make you feel? And the participant would click or would enter that word in here, and they would kind of give you an example or a description of why they felt how they felt. And the last question, since we know that not a lot of people like to fill out surveys, is where are you located? Just for us to have an indication of where that feeling is coming from. And once you were able to complete those three questions, you click on submit, and your word would be populated to the left or to the right. If you're looking at the screen, left of the screen, they will be populated there. And so this was one of the applications that, like I said, we found very revolutionary, because as much as GIS has evolved and as much as location intelligence has evolved, sentiment mapping is something that we haven't seen. And if it's out there, maybe we're not aware of it. So we felt this would be very, very powerful, especially in giving the community a voice, and for them to actually feel included and feel like their opinion matters, if they were to see something like this and see that their voice was heard. So those are just all the demos that I had for now or for today. But I would like to kick it back to the session moderators so that we can answer some questions that have been coming in here.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, both of you, for your presentation. Yes, so we have a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is this equity dashboard publicly available? If so, how can we access it?
So this application was an application that we put together here at Esri Professional Services. It's not yet publicly available. It's an application that has been made available to organizations or companies that have deemed interest in it. But it's something that we can always have a conversation about in regards to its availability. But to answer the question, no, it's not yet been made publicly available.
Now, the workforce equity dashboard is that one, the oh wait, did we show that?
No, we
We
didn't. I
didn't.
know
Oh,
what
never
you're
mind.
talking about. Yeah. There's one that's available on the Racial Equity Hub site. That's actually available, and I can leave a link here for those who are interested. We kind of took that and evolved that to something that to the demo that you are all seeing over here.
Okay, another question. Which organization should be performing racial equity and visioning process you describe? How should I sell that to my company?
Mm. If your organization is looking to do and something that's enterprise wide, where if maybe it's around workforce equity, or maybe it's just around social impact, or maybe it's both, maybe it's work, maybe it's supplier equity. If they're looking to make change systemically, then they could benefit from an envisioning process. And there are, depending on the nature of the relationship and where thing and how ready the organization is, there are a wide there's a lot of different options for how we can work with organizations to make that happen. All of that is based on best practices for enterprise architecture, geospatial envisioning, all intersected with best practices for racial equity and social justice derived from work by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, from Raise Forward and the GARE Network. So maybe one thing I can do is drop a link to um, to some of the body of work that it's based on. Embedded within a lot of that work is a lot of the call to action for why an organization would take on something like this, and maybe that can help you make the case.
Okay, now it's more data question. It's, aside from the American Community Survey, ACS, as we know, data set, where can I find some credible data sources for visualizing demographic data?
That's a good question. I don't know if whoever asked knows about the Living Atlas that Esri provides. And we have a whole team here at Esri that consolidates demographic information, puts that together, and actually symbolizes it and makes it available to be consumed by certain applications and maps. So I know that some of the data that the Living Atlas data sets have incorporated ACS data, but there's more data, or there's more information that has been put together and served out as a service for those who would want to kind of take advantage of that. And that's all in Living Atlas. If you just Google Esri Living Atlas, you'll see all that the data sets available there. But if you also want to go to the Racial Equity Hub site, we have a page where we have a link where you can get to all those data sets and applications as well.
Okay, I have a question. If our students would like to involve with either of your organization, how can they reach out to you, or what's the process?
Yeah, I'll drop links to our websites in the chat as soon
Yeah.
as I can find the chat.
Because I
Yeah.
think especially our geography students who are taking GIS classes would be interested in, definitely Black Girls Maps or North Star.
Mhm.
Is there an avenue that you can provide that would be excellent to
Yeah.
encourage students?
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. Go ahead.
Okay. First, I'll speak on behalf of Black Girls Map. I'm just the co-founder. Whitney Katluski is my colleague that we started this organization with. We typically have social media, right? I know for our youth, we're big on social media. So we are on Twitter, we are on Instagram, and you can just it's at Black Girls Map. I think Laura's on the line. I don't know, Laura, if you can add those links into the chat window, that would be great. But you can find us on social media. And not only that, we have a email where you can send us a link, which is blackgirlsmap@esri.com. And I'll put all the contact information there. We've worked with, or we've collaborated with students where we have had joint projects that we consult with, or we talk to various students. So feel free to just reach out to us. You can DM us on Instagram too, or Twitter. We're very responsive. Go ahead,
And
Clinton.
and yeah, North Star, you can find all of our social media links at gisnorthstar.org. Likewise, we've got a group on LinkedIn that we're evolving into a page, and certainly interested in continuing to grow the network. I think both of our sites have places where people can submit information about themselves. If you are of the African diaspora, we're excited to have you join our atlases of where folks are, whether they be Black women or just Black people more broadly. There's contact forms if you want to reach out for speaking opportunities. We encourage students to reach out for speaking opportunities all throughout the year. We like to be a platform to create space where there might not otherwise be space. We want to engage with students of color in particular because we understand beyond just encouraging people to study hard, do the right thing, demonstrate your skill, that sometimes you're going to have to interrupt bias. And throughout the year, we'll have workshops and opportunities to give people hands-on training to do things and opportunities to demonstrate and evolve their skill sets.
Okay, thank you. And kind of in that note, Clinton, if you can talk about the North Star Bridge program, that I know it's just in the developing phase, but if you can give us a little.
Yeah, so one of the main focus, there's a bunch of intersecting focus areas for North Star that brought us to the point where we knew we needed to create a focused program. So when you think of diversity versus diversity and inclusion, and all the ways in which people try to increase diversity, like perhaps give someone a scholarship and propel them into a scholarship or a career in GIS, um, the reality is we're sending people into spaces that aren't necessarily designed to nurture them, and those spaces themselves are within a context that is definitely designed in ways to society to do harm to folks, and without necessarily having ready access to mentorship and support along the way, people who are eager and happy to give you advice and take you under their wing, peers who you can connect with and build a network with. It can be really hard, even if you are an amazing talent and highly credentialed, to really thrive in GIS if you're a person of color, if you're Black in particular. So we wanted to build a program that did more than just propel people into GIS, but also supported people along their journey, whether through scholarship, through professional pursuits, or through entrepreneurial pursuits. So we're creating what we call the North Star Bridge, that bridge being a platform that gets people from wherever, people of African descent, from where they are today and into and through scholarship and careers and entrepreneurial ventures in GIS. And that program is going to include things like cash grants direct to students, software grants to colleges and universities that serve a predominantly Black population, all to sort of inspire a scholarship. Participants who receive cash grants will become a part of a network of networks that we call the North Star Network, where they can find peer mentorship. They'll find accelerated pathways to opportunities to develop and evolve their skills and to showcase their talents. That program is going to be augmented with several layers of mentorship and other kinds of support. And we are actively looking for additional support in providing a variety of scholarships to aid in the development. Esri is actually one of the biggest donors right now in terms of cash grants. So starting in the fall, we're going to be issuing 10 cash grants to Black students getting into or through GIS programs. We have already begun issuing software grants to HBCUs, and like I said, we're looking for additional partners to help us provide more opportunities to more and more folks.
Thank you. Another question in the chat. How do I start an organization in my community, my own community? Would you able to help with the startups in Canada?
Hmm. That's a good question. One really interesting thing is like GIS is a really good tool to help figure out, like who your market is, where you can find people. I'd say that. I'd also say tap into mentor networks. There are folks in the North Star network, for instance, um, who are entrepreneurs and I'm sure would be happy to field, some focused questions around, like problem sets you might be facing and advice you may want or need. And if you send us your information, reach out through the North Star website, we'll try to get you in contact maybe with somebody specifically in Canada. Maybe provide some information about the kind of organization that you want to start, and that can help us match you up with the right people.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat. If possible, can you go over how you include the race and age overview infographic in the dashboard?
Yeah, absolutely. So the race and age overview, these are the information product that you see there. It was more like a result from using Business Analyst Online. So with Business Analyst Online, that's another solution that Esri provides. It has different variables, demographic information that can be incorporated to generate this report. So just a quick answer to that is we used Business Analyst Online. We picked that, these variables to specifically chose race, demographic information, as well as age, population age information. Those are separate categories that you can include into the infographic. And then there's certain settings that you just have to configure for you to see the result that you're seeing, that you saw during the demo. Now, one thing I will say about Esri infographics is they're I love them because they're very interactive. So they're not static, right? They are you're able to kind of, you have pop-ups or you have hover text. So when you click on a particular graph indicator, it provides you information on that. So it's pretty much Business Analyst Online, picking your variables, configuring how you want the infographic to look, like the setup, and then generate, and Business Analyst does the rest for you.
Thank you. Any more questions?
There was one in the chat
Oh,
from somebody from Black Lives Matter Boise. Now, I'd certainly be interested in learning more about what your needs are, but we've got a nonprofit program that you can reach out to, very low cost. We also have a new, I don't know what to call it, but there's a disaster response program that Esri has had for some time now. And anytime, an organization is facing a disaster like a hurricane, a storm, or COVID-19, organizations reach out and we pair them up with support immediately. Starting last summer, we opened up that opportunity to organizations that are focused on racial equity as well. So if you've got a racial equity or social justice related challenge that you need to tackle right away, we can get you connected with tools and volunteer resources, pretty quickly. And you can get started with those, with all of this by visiting esri.com/racial-equity. I dropped the link in the chat. From there, you can find the Racial Equity Hub, and that includes lots of resources managed by our very own Raina Kamal here, um, including training, data, examples, and you can also get some inspiration about like how you can apply GIS to these contexts. And at the bottom of that page, you can sign up for the nonprofit program and/or reach out for support around whether it be a disaster or a racial equity focused need.
thank you. Another question in the chat. How do I convince stakeholders to invest in GIS projects that will help identify inequities?
I think the reality is equity is a spatial analysis. It's really hard to understand where inequities are without understanding location. When people say Black people or people of color are not a monolith, a part of that reality is from one end of the country to the next, from one part of your city to the next, Black people or people of color or other marginalized groups are not having the exact same experience. So you need to
Mhm.
understand that location piece if it's important for you to address those issues. So GIS is pretty relevant. And if for organizations that can place a value on equity, we can certainly you reach out to you know there's a contact page. We'll get you connected with folks who can help you craft the business case around this. And that's just something we do as a sales development organization to support customers.
And I guess just to add on to that, I think we should also give ourselves grace, right? Because this whole conversation, sometimes winning them over might not be an overnight thing, right? It could be a whole journey. It's not a sprint. It's not I show you this and you're just automatically wowed. Sometimes it's a journey. And so I think we have to also kind of be consistent, and continue kind of voicing and evangelizing the use and benefit of GIS, especially in having these conversations, but not quitting after showcasing, one demonstration and that didn't really win them over. Just continue doing it, because from my experience as a technical advisor, we've had to have several meetings before we even kind of engage at that level where we want to use location intelligence. But it is a journey. It's not an overnight thing.
Mhm.
Agree with that. And I sort of take for granted, as somebody who talks about this stuff all the time, that people will just talk about it. But I realize that a big part of the challenge is shifting people's paradigm.
Yep.
And today, the reason why these things persist is because by and large, people don't understand that harm is actually being done. Um, Very often, I have a background of one of Ta-Nehisi Coates' quotes about the actual visceral impact of racism. So I think businesses move when they understand things like a burning platform. And when we talk about race and racism in terms like sometimes when we just say things like inequities or problematic, it doesn't really hammer home the issues. So be consistent, speak as clearly to the challenges as possible. Talk about the impact to life, talk about alignment with values, and I would say be as clear as you feel comfortable being.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there's any more questions. Jasmine, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I think one last one. When we're thinking about sort of, right, you mentioned, Clinton, how we view the world. I'm gonna cut off my video because it's cutting off. But how we view the world, there's a lot of data that I think we're not collecting that really tells the local story. So for local organizations that are engaged in this equity work, how do you recommend that they start building these local data sets?
I am like the enemy of most folks GIS because I think what we're talking about. If this was a problem that we solved before, then sure, I would say the data must exist somewhere. But it isn't, right? So I think we're gonna have to collect new data all the time. A colleague of mine reminded me that the reality is the question there's a big question mark about whether or not the census is collecting the right data about race all the time. Because on the one hand, it's asking you whether or not how you identify racially, but the bigger question is how do systems treat you? How do people identify you? So if the census is missing a big concept like
Mhm.
that, then all of us should, to your point, Raina, give ourselves grace and realize that we need to dig deep, think 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 differently about the questions we're framing, the kinds of the kinds of data we need to answer those questions, and deploy surveys, collect new insight, gather some qualitative information enough so you can craft new hypotheses about what you need to collect from a quantitative perspective. I think the more folks we can get using their own surveys, automating their workflows and collecting demographic information about their constituents and the people they're serving, the more data we can share with each other. I think there's a huge need to collect historical data around regions, because all of this work really begins with what is the root cause? What's in the past that has created these issues? There's lots of data that speak to the outcome of policies, but not a whole lot of data that speaks to the policies themselves. Black Girls Map went on a whole mission to collect some information about policymakers and their decisions, and make that available. That stuff's important, and we all need to sort of dig deep and figure out how best to do that. And there's lots and lots of tools for that'll help folks collect data to do that work.
Well, thank you very much. It was a very interesting topic that we discussed today, and thank you for all the information, all the details. I'm sure our students will be reaching out to you as they continue your career at CSI. And I just want to thank you again for coming to our Black History Month presentation, and looking forward to the other events you have for this month. I encourage all of you who are on the call to check it out. We're going to send out some information later. Thank you again.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Take care.